Ah, yes, friends. On a Monday morning, it is OGP live on YouTube and in your ear, wherever you get your podcast needs to be filled. As always, I am Adam Armbrecht, joined by the healthy, the wealthy, and maybe slightly sad after a Knicks loss on a Sunday, Andy Makowitz.
Yeah, tough loss for the Knicks last night. The big takeaway, the Garden was rocking. It's great to see fans back in the stands, Adam. You saw it, with the PGA Championship, Phil Mickelson winning, the crowd surrounding the green. It feels like sports are getting back to normal, which is a good sign for this upcoming NFL season and a good sign in New York for the New York Football Giants.
Yeah, you better believe it, man. You could clearly tell from the Knicks game. I mean, obviously, a hungry fan base, but they were loud, they were vocal. I'm obviously a Nets guy, for as disparaging as it can be around the fan base and how active they are. Barclays Center sounded good for Barclays Center for the percentage of fans that they let it in, but I mean, the MSG was absolutely going insane. I mean, from the tip off, every single shot, every single play. So it was really cool, really exciting. It's a shame that the Knicks were unable to get the win, but should make for an exciting series nonetheless. On the Giants side, as you said, it'll be nice for the football to have fans in the stands, and obviously it'll be outdoors. So you'd like to assume, with some level of certainty, that by September, outdoor stadiums be full capacity, and it'll be as normal as we've had things be in a couple of years. The interesting thing, go ahead.
I was going to say that the thing that I think is most noteworthy is I think football has the biggest need for having fans in the stands of any of the sports. You look at the NBA, the players are on display there, and it's a little bit more of an intimate setting, so you can really see the stars shine. The NFL, with the helmets on and not being able to see things, like, you need that crowd noise. You need that for as physical as that game can get. So I'm just thinking about how, it looked great for the Knicks and MSG with all the fans there. It's going to be even better for the Giants to be able to have fans in the stands rooting them on.
Yeah, and I hope that we see that level of energy. Giants are a passionate fan base, obviously, but come out with that same type week 1 against Denver, right? Let's really hear the stadium shaking to its core, possibly to its foundation, because we could always build a new one if anybody wanted a better looking stadium. That's neither here nor there, though. We come in because last time we talked about Daniel Jones, what we expect for him. How does he have a great season that'll lead to the Giants having a great season? And obviously we talked about touchdowns, interceptions, completion percentage. And it got me thinking about the receiving core for the Giants and then around the division as a whole. There was a fun article on Fansided that went through the tallest, the fastest, and then the surest hands within the division. So before we get into the surest hands of it all, let's just see if Andy Makowitz has a beat on this. Who's the tallest receiving core in the division?
Tallest receiving core would be the Dallas Cowboys.
Fantastic, sir. Averaging 73.8 inches in height. They've got obviously a collection of players there when you talk about Cooper. They also have Faroko, who stands at 6'4" there. Oddly enough, for the Giants, who come in, I want to make sure I get it right, second tallest in the division is Kenny Golladay, and yet they are the third tallest in the division, behind the Washington football team, but slightly ahead of the Philadelphia Eagles. So obviously, you can draw a direct correlation between height and the ability to win championships. The second piece that they talked about, we'll touch on briefly, is speed. Who's the fastest team in the division?
Fastest team in the division I'm going with is the New York Football Giants.
You are correct once again, sir. And obviously, it's partially because they added in, a player like Darius Slayton in the draft, but also added a player like John Ross in free agency. So 4.22 40 time for Ross is leads. Yes, exactly. A little bit of whew, I think when you hear that kind of number come out, and then you get guys. The closest one in the division is Curtis Samuel with Washington at 4.31, by the way, and then McLaurin at 4.35. So even though the Giants may be the fastest in the division, when you're adding in a guy like John Ross, who may not see necessarily the biggest share, and then you hear Washington, those are their number 1 and number 2 receivers right there that are going to be bringing that type of speed. So certainly, as we've said before, Washington is going to present challenges, and speed is going to be a part of it on the offensive side of the ball for them.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. The whole John Ross thing is really interesting because he is like a track guy. We don't know how much he's going to get on the field, but you add him and you add Tony in, and the room becomes lightning fast for the Giants.
So now we get to really, this is the meat. That was the potatoes. That was the aperitif. The meat of it, though, is catch percentages and what we can expect from the New York Football Giants. Because as we've said, we all know, going back to the past couple of years, you can talk about Evan Ingram and his issues catching the football. And by the way, one of the guys that actually was more sure-handed for the New York Football Giants in recent memory was Golden Tate. He is no longer on the roster. So when you think about surest hands in the division, who tops this list for you?
Surest hands, I would go with the Washington football team.
Once again, good sir, at 66%. And again, so the interesting thing is on their careers, like McLaurin is a 64, Curtis Samuel is 63%. But what's interesting about them is if you go back and take a look at the last couple of years, last season alone, what you end up getting, and I'll pull these numbers up for everybody on YouTube. So Washington has a player like Samuel who came off a 79% catch percentage last year. I mean, that was otherworldly to me. And I think our scroll bar is a little bit off here as I was listening. Goddard and Ward first there. That should go underneath Philadelphia's tag, 71 and 67%. There's some high percentages there within the division. When you get down to the Giants, so we made the most notable. This is going off of last year's top 100 catch percentages. So what's interesting is that Washington actually gives you 3 because they're going to give you Samuel. They're also going to give you, the running
Antonio
back.
Gibson. Yep.
Yes, thank you, Andy. He's going to be coming out of the backfield well. And that made it notable to me because when you look at the Giants, Shepard gave you 73%. I went back to 2019 for Saquon Barkley, 71% for him. Most running backs bubble up near 80% when we talk about catch percentages. Overall, what do you think about the Giants' receiving core, the improvements we think we've made, even with a guy like Kyle Rudolph at the tight end position? But food for thought, Kenny Golladay is a 58% career catch percentage. So, he's a big play guy. We love him. He's going to be a big target when it comes to the red zone. Also, though, have the Giants really safeguarded that concern around Daniel Jones and making sure who he's throwing to is going to be sure-handed and reliable?
Well, the one thing I think that's noteworthy about this exercise is think about the type of throwers that you also have throwing the ball and the types of throws that they can make. You look at what was happening with Curtis Samuel, who was in Carolina. He had Teddy Bridgewater throwing him the ball, wasn't really moving the ball down the field that much. You look at the Washington football team in general. You had Dwayne Haskins for a cup of coffee, and then you have Alex Smith doing check down dump plays. And so it's no secret that they would end up being higher up in terms of the catch percentages. The bottom 2 teams are Dallas and the New York Football Giants. Oh, Dallas just signed their franchise quarterback for $40 million a year. He can get the ball down the field and he can stretch defenses. Well, I think this, I'm not too concerned about the catch percentages if it means that the Giants are taking more shots down the field, looking to be more explosive. I think we're going to get a mixed bag knowing that Kenny Golladay is averaging over 15 yards a catch. He is the big play guy. That's going to just bring in its fair share of incompletions. But with a healthy Saquon Barkley, with a healthy Sterling Shepard, and now bringing Kadarius Toney into the mix, trying to get him some of those short gadget plays, I think the percentages are going to kind of even themselves out for the New York Football Giants.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? I mean, for whatever it's worth, Sterling Shepard's the only receiver on the Giants roster right now with a career catch percentage over 60 at 67%. But to your point, even when you go back like recent history bias, when you talk about a guy like Samuel, well, 79%. That's obviously, to your point, skewed by the type of scheme that's being run there. Likewise for the Eagles, what's interesting for them is that they're the lowest in the division in terms of catch percentage, but it's also based off of like Greg Ward led the Eagles with a catch percentage of 68. Starter Jalen Reagor has an average of 57%. So I'm going to wrap it back around to the Giants, but it does become interesting to think about. It's like when you're a team that's trying to scheme to get the ball into the hands of your playmakers in sure methods, right? And a guy like Reagor, first round pick, and I'll compare it to Toney, right? Reagor came in last year. I don't care who was the quarterback there. He was dropping a lot of balls. If you're the Giants and Kadarius Toney comes in and he's a 50-50 catch guy, percent chance, that's going to be a problem. So I think you're right? The way in which you get the ball into the playmaker's hands is going to impact these percentages and skew the numbers one way or the other. But if you are the Giants wide receiving core, when those big plays are there, and this is the Evan Ingram, right, conundrum of, boy, this guy makes some crazy catches, but when you just need him to catch a 12-yard pass over the middle for a first down, he seemingly can't make that happen.
Yeah, well, touching back on the Eagles for 1 second, it's no surprise that they're as low as they are because we talk about how the quarterback impacts these catch percentages. Carson Wentz had his worst season ever, literally his worst season ever. 57% completion percentage, touchdown interception ratio was about even, 16 touchdowns to 15 interceptions. And then he gets benched for Jalen Hurts, who goes out there and lights it up with a 52% completion percentage. So he was ostensibly worse than Carson Wentz. So you look at someone like the Eagles, of course the wide receivers catch rates are going to struggle because both of their quarterbacks were wildly inaccurate. What I think is more noteworthy for the Giants is Daniel Jones does throw a good deep ball. He does have the ability to stretch the ball down the field if given a little bit of time by the offensive line. But it will be interesting to see the balance. I think you're going to see stark differences between someone like Kenny Golladay and Kadarius Toney in terms of their catch percentages because you're asking them to do two completely different things. One guy's getting the ball as soon as physically possible, get him out into space and see what happens. The other guy wants to get down the field. Maybe he's not going to make the play every time, but that one big play goes in the end zone for 6 points.
No, and that's the difference, right? When you see a number like 58% for Golladay, you go, oh, boy, was he got a case of the dropsies? No, well, there's a far cry difference between jump ball opportunities, contested catch opportunities versus a lot of slot receivers or guys out of the backfield. It's why running backs have such a high catch percentage in general because they're just leaking out of the backfield and saying, put it in the old breadbasket, friend, and I'll go ahead and treat it like an extended running play. So 100%. These numbers are, I think, as I said at the top, this is fun to discuss. And also, I don't put much stock in it beyond, hey, when I need the play, are you making the play? Now, the one guy that also is carried over and that I mentioned, Saquon Barkley, doesn't have the greatest catch percentage. Before we can get into him a little bit, but I kind of want to set the table here for this season. What is success then for this receiving core for the New York Football Giants? What does the year need to look like for Kenny Golladay, for Sterling Shepard? And listen, this is hard to kind of cast a narrow net because everyone's important. Obviously Golladay is, obviously Shepard is. Obviously Slayton is still going to be important because he's going to see really friendly matchups. But Kadarius Toney is going to be the versatile gadget do-it-all player. He's going to be important. And then Saquon Barkley as well. So, pick your poison. Where do you want to start with? How do we set the benchmark for what will be a good season for these players individually?
Yeah. So on the individual piece, I think the easiest one and the first one that you can say is Kenny Golladay has to have over 1,000 yards receiving. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. You don't pay a number one wide receiver $20 million a year to get you 600 yards. Like, he has to come out and be a true number one wide receiver. He's been able to show when he's healthy in Detroit that he has the ability to put up 1,000 yards, 1,200 yards, even creeping up into the top 10 of the league. So for me, it's a simple one, starting with him saying you paid him the big money. He's the big free agent that we pulled in. He has to lead this team in receiving yards. If he doesn't, something went wrong.
Yeah, you would assume so. Oddly enough, and I'll save an interesting wrinkle on that front as we get closer to the season, because we always do like to do some of our predictions, maybe some of our dark horse candidates to have big years. But I do think you're right. When you talk about a guy outside of last year where he was injured, 2017, slow season start there, obviously as well, only started 5 games. But over the last 2 years prior to the injury, went for 1,000 yards, went for 1,200 yards, right? That's the biggest thing to me. I think for him, I will just say, yardage isn't nearly as big, maybe for me, as touchdown catches, right? You can paint a picture where I'd be shocked if he went for 900 yards or something. But if he went for 900 yards but had 12 touchdown catches, right, I would say, okay, so the other guys are doing some of the legwork and you're finishing the drives off for us. That's what we want to see here. You're drawing the coverage, and Shepard, Toney, these other players are really making the ball move. But it'll be interesting to see how he gets utilized and how this offense really maximizes his value with that size and listen, strength, and even a little bit of speed. Like, I think he's has a deceptive speed there, especially when you talk about a player that can run routes, not just on the outside, but also over the middle of the field. Shepard, then a guy that's in that 650 to 850-ish kind of range, player, 60 plus ish catches. Where does he need to get to for you to feel like, hey, we checked this box with him?
So I'm going to talk about the wide receiving core and the pass catchers as a whole. In going do it in our head as Giant fans, we kind of sit here and we say, okay, this guy needs to get this many yards. This guy has to get that many yards. The Giants are loaded this year. And when you start trying to figure out the numbers, like you all of a sudden, if you're saying, okay, Kenny Golladay is good for about 1,000, Sterling Shepard's good for 600, which is on the lower end of what he's been averaging, 6, 7, 800. As you go down the list and you say, okay, well, how much is Slayton going to have? How much is Tony going to have? How much is Ingram going to have? How much is Rudolph? How much is Saquon out of the backfield going to get? All of a sudden, like if you take out yeah, you like that. When you add it up and you get the calculator out and you start putting all these numbers in, it says that Daniel Jones is going to have over 4,000 yards because it's impossible if these guys stay healthy that even if Rudolph only catches a couple balls, you could probably slate him in for 300 receiving yards, right? Like that doesn't seem to be too far fetched in a 17 game season. You're talking about what, 20 yards a game for Rudolph? Like that's achievable. Evan Ingram, if you put him down for what, 450, 500 yards, like all of a sudden you just put these all together and you're saying Daniel Jones is going to throw for over 4,000 yards, which I don't know if we were just to say in a vacuum, do you think Daniel Jones is going to throw for that? You'd probably say, no, I don't know if he will.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's because even if I was trying to do those numbers in my head a little bit, like you say, throw Golladay, even if you took Evan Ingram, Rudolph, and Saquon Barkley, right? Let's just say, and I'm setting a very low bar of, okay, maybe 1,200 yards for those three players combined, right? And you take the over more often than not on it. You throw another 1,500 between Shepard and Slayton alone. And right there, you're at 3,900 yards, and then Kadarius Toney. And what he might be able to do for you. It's interesting to look at it that way and say, boy, and this brings us back to our last episode, right? And having this discussion around why are the Giants win totals so low and why did Peter King come out and rank them 20th in the NFL overall? You say, listen, why the disrespect? It all comes down to Daniel Jones, right? When you talk about these weapons around him, it seems like, the worst quarterbacks could get these guys to 600, 700 yards on a season, right? Darius Slayton on a team where Shepard was hurt and wasn't on the field a lot, where Evan Ingram was struggling mightily, where the offensive line was young and still developing last year. Slayton still had a very respectable statistical season, So it's hard to see how these guys are going to somehow regress inside of this system with now two new additional, more dynamic weapons on the roster.
And that's what I keep going back to. And we keep talking about, the last 2 years, Darius Slayton had somewhere between, 740 yards in 29, 751. So he's good for 700 now. I think that'll come down quite a bit, knowing that his role is going to change with Kenny Golladay being on the outside as opposed to Golden Tate this year. But I mean, even if you slate Darius Slayton down for 500 yards, like you start chunking it away and you think to yourself, man, like it's going to be tough for this wide receiving core to not get Daniel Jones above 3,500 yards. And, injuries happen, and that will be a huge factor in this. Kenny Golladay has had injury history. Sterling Shepard, injury history. Saquon Barkley missed him almost the whole entire year last year. So, in a vacuum, these guys over-unders would lead you to say Daniel Jones is going to have 4,000 yards, but one or two of them is going to get, inexplicably hurt and going to be missing some time.
Interestingly enough, I think the Shepard piece is interesting, right? We know that it's, last year, what's it going to look like, the contract numbers, where does he fit into this with Tony and with Golladay in the short and long term? I wonder if one of two things, either early in the season, we see the establishment of Slayton still, even with Golladay there, and then Tony emerging, and Shepard kind of gets shuffled back a little bit just because there's only so many balls to go around, or that he establishes himself and shows enough early that maybe there's value there as you work your way towards the trade deadline. You know, it's all gonna come down to how do these other boxes check off. Does Slayton look even more dynamic now that you've added Golladay? Does Tony hit the ground running? When you think about a player like Jefferson from last year, it took 4 or 5 weeks to really click it in, and then all of a sudden, watch out, right? He was phenomenal for the Minnesota Vikings. So if you start to see that from the young players, then Shepard does become a somewhat expendable piece. And I wonder how it impacts his rep in the time that he's going to see on the field.
Well, what I keep going back to as I look at this receiving core, you say success is what? It's not about the individual. I keep going back to the idea of it's just the collective group as a whole. And to your point, if Golladay gets 900 yards, I still think that that's preposterous for someone making $20 million a year if he's healthy.
Right.
You know, ultimately, it's going to be fascinating to figure out how Jason Garrett is going to be able to put this offense together, because how many times during the game are the Giants going to be in a 4 wide receiver set?
Yeah.
But what I'll tell you is if they're not
For sure. No, listen, it's going to be interesting to see how all these weapons get utilized, and we'll dive into it. But this to me is, you know, I don't want to call it the dog days, right? As you get into training camp and we're waiting to hear who's bubbled up and become better, right? Who's taken over a role, who's claiming this right guard starting position for the Giants on the offensive line. That could play a huge factor in how we predict the wide receivers and what they're capable of doing, or what Daniel Jones is capable of. But I think it is worth kind of speculating on it, because you do want to have an idea in your mind. Week 1 against Denver, I want to have a sense of what I want to see from the bevy of weapons that the New York Football Giants have for Daniel Jones now. And oddly enough, we'll get into this next time because we had a little bit of a hiccup on the front end starting off this episode. But what do we expect for Saquon Barkley this year? I think that's the big show tease. And, you know, and we can even, I think, to the way that you've done it in this episode, I think we can kind of bring it to the running back group as a whole, right? There, once upon a time when it was only Saquon Barkley, we thought, well, we obviously need to have him run for 1,500 to 2,000 yards. Also, love to see him catch 600 yards out of the backfield too. Now we've kind of balanced out this running group a little bit more, where we can say who's specialized in certain roles, where can we utilize them, and how does it allow Saquon Barkley to be in less usage more effective, right? I mean, that has to be the goal when you're talking about a running back coming off a major injury and one that you just picked up the 5th-year option on. So that'll be something that we can dive into. Closing thoughts, Andy, before we get out the door?
No, I just, you know, the one thing I find fascinating about the wide receiver room and just pass catchers as a whole is we have 2 bona fide starting tight ends, 4 bona fide starting wide receivers. Those numbers don't necessarily add up to all of them being on the field at the same time. Right. I'm really curious to see how the Giants deploy a guy like Kadarius Toney, or when they decide to go to 2 tight end sets with Rudolph and Ingram. The Giants, for the first time in a while, have so much talent on offense that opposing teams are going to have challenges like we are predicting who's going to be the one that leads the team in receiving. How are they going to line up? Where are people going to be? I mean, Toney could be in the backfield with Barkley. So for me, it's interesting. We're going to have to dive in a little bit more on the Saquon Barkley piece, as you mentioned. But the pass catchers as a whole is a fascinating group this year for the Giants.
Rep percentages, right? Never thought we'd be talking about that. How many snaps are these guys going to get? That's where we'll be in the weeds as we push our way towards the season. You can, of course, follow us on social media at One Giant Podcast. You can rate, review, subscribe to the podcast wherever you get it. 5 stars. Tell us how much, Andy looks like a young George Clooney on the YouTube, because we've heard a lot throughout his day-to-day life. But, spread the love. We really appreciate it as we continue to build this monster that is the OGP. Until next time, as Andy Makowitz wants, needs, and demands that you know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.